Last week, we journeyed with Jesus to hell. This week, we're going to see Jesus tell Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And we're going to think, "Peter, you're doing so great. What happened?" But yeah, we journeyed with Jesus to hell. The Jewish leaders, who now include the Sadducees, they came to test Jesus. According to the Greek that Jesus used, they actually came viciously or with malice towards Jesus. And on the heels of this second conflict with Jerusalem, as Jesus butts heads with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, Jesus again departs for Gentile lands. On the way, his disciples get a lesson on earthly focus versus heavenly focus. The disciples, they get wrapped up in this worry that, "Oh no, we forgot bread for the journey." More specifically, I think they get wrapped up in the worry as to how this will reflect on them and how it will impact their standing with Jesus. Because they still very much are in this orientation that their status with Jesus rests on what they can do, and if they mess up, they may lose status with Jesus. And so they're still concerned with earthly concerns of bread and position with other people. But we saw that due to their earthly mindedness, they were unable to perceive Jesus' words spiritually. Jesus spoke to them of yeast, and he didn't even mean literal yeast, but they took it that way because they're wrapped up in the world. And so Jesus pointed out to them all his earthly miracles. And he says, "Do you really think, after what you've seen me do, I'm worried about real yeast? Do you think I'm worried about the bread?" And the disciples go, no, maybe not. And their lesson is to look deeper than the surface things, the earthly things, and to plug into divine perception, things that are deeper than just what meets our human eyes. And then Jesus, with his disciples, they arrive at hell. Specifically, Jesus took his disciples to Caesarea Philippi. This place is located at the foot of Mount Hermon. The mountain itself was associated for thousands of years with evil, with demonic activity, with horrible things. And at Caesarea Philippi, at the foot of evil Mount Hermon, there was a cave that was believed to be the entrance to Hades, the entrance to the realm of the dead, the place that we call hell. So Jesus takes his disciples to the entrance to hell. And it's in front of the realm of the dead that Jesus opens the door for Peter to declare that Jesus is the Son of the living God, the Messiah. And the interplay of words that follows, we saw that Peter becomes Peter. It means a rock. He becomes a rock through his association with the rock. The rock is Jesus. But we have to remember, we've seen of Peter that Matthew's making Peter a representative of all of the church. All of us who want to consider ourselves to be the church are wrapped up, represented by Peter. John the Baptist was the representative or the embodiment of all that came before Jesus. Jesus is the embodiment of God, so that he says no one can claim to know God except for what you come to know through me. And Peter then is the embodiment of all of us who are in the church. And we're all meant to become Peters, and we do become Peters. We become a rock. We become rock when we associate ourselves like Peter with the rock. Jesus is the rock. He is the cornerstone upon which the church is built. But when we become rock as well, we join with Jesus. We contribute to the foundation of the church. And the church going forward into the future is built even on us. So in front of the realm of the dead, in front of hell, Jesus tells Peter that the power of death will not defeat the church of the living God. And we close by looking at Matthew 16:20. It says, Jesus sternly ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. The word Messiah is also the word Christ. So he said, don't tell anyone that I am Jesus, the Christ, even though now you've figured it out. Again, the word sternly here, like I said last week, it doesn't really mean angry like I would picture in my head. The Greek means explicit or clearly. So Jesus, clearly, he wants to make very explicit, very clear, don't tell anybody this. Jesus got all excited about the breakthrough of Peter. Why wouldn't he be excited then to go spread the word and have a breakthrough for everyone? I would think that this would be the time for him to tell, great, you found the truth, Peter. Now go spread the truth. And Jesus would say, go tell your friends and have them tell their friends. But instead, Jesus shuts his disciples down. And it feels like he kind of sours the mood. He says, now you don't get to tell anybody this. You don't get to tell anybody that I'm the Christ. And from this place in Matthew 16 up through Matthew 26, Jesus will never explicitly identify himself as the Christ. So what the heck is going on, Jesus? Well, in the next verses, we get to see just what the heck's going on. We get to Matthew 16, 21 through 22. And it says, from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must. In the Greek, it's this is. Peter's saying, this is to never happen to you. This is not going to happen over my dead body. And the problem with the disciples going off and telling people that Jesus is the Christ, it immediately becomes clear. The disciples still don't understand the term Christ. So how can they tell people of Jesus the Christ if they don't understand what it means? First, in verse 21, it opens with the phrase, from that time on. So from that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples. It's an interesting contrast that he's showing his disciples against the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who only a few verses before had come to Jesus and used the same Greek word and said, show us a sign from heaven. We want to be shown. It's the same. And between these two instances, we see Jesus meeting people where they're at. The showing to the Pharisees and the Sadducees is something basic, something that will be easily observable with the naked eye. Jesus says, for you, I'll meet you on the sign of Jonah. I'm going to be in the grave for 3 days. I'm going to come out. That's something very basic for you. The thing he's showing his disciples is much deeper and more detailed. And we get a list of the things that must happen. From that time on, though, it splits Matthew's gospel into two. The phrase was first spoken in Matthew 4:17, where it says, from that time on, Jesus began to proclaim, repent. This is change the way you think. This isn't, the church has made this a guilt-ridden grovel, and we don't really change the way we think other than we just think we're kind of crappy. Repent means change the way you picture everything. Change the way you think, because the kingdom of heaven has come near. So that's the first time that the phrase from that time was used. And so now we're in Matthew 16:21, and again it says, from that time. These two statements, they mark the two major phases of Jesus' ministry. First was his ministry of power and calling people to think differently. Now, in this new phase of ministry, it is the ministry of giving up power on his journey to the cross. The second phase of his ministry is going to expand from just Jesus, God with us, to now Jesus, the Christ. And from that time on, we read that Jesus began to show his disciples that it was necessary that, and there's a list. He goes to Jerusalem. He suffers at the hands of religious leaders. He is to be killed, and he will be raised on the third day. It isn't told here that Jesus' manner of death, that how he will be killed would be crucifixion, although that's hinted at in the next section. But the crucifixion was considered extremely necessary by early Christians. And much of that rests in this moment with Jesus. So necessary was the crucifixion considered that Paul, Origen, and other early Christians, they said that you could share Jesus without all the other stuff. But you could not share Jesus the Christ without also sharing Jesus the crucified. To separate Jesus from his crucifixion was understood by many early Christians to make Jesus no Christ at all. Specific to Origen, he said, you can't preach Jesus the Christ without preaching Jesus on the cross. And so Jesus, he has sternly ordered his disciples not to tell anyone. He's clearly ordered them. The disciples were forbidden from telling anyone of Jesus the Christ because they couldn't comprehend it. They didn't understand it yet. Because you can't separate Christ from the crucifixion. And Christ had yet to be crucified. The disciples do not yet understand what it means to be Christ and to be able to share him with anyone, because they have not yet gone through and seen the crucifixion. In other words, without the crucifixion, the disciples could not proclaim Jesus Christ the right way. So Jesus says, you can't share me yet. So Jesus says, I'm going to go die, guys. I'm going to suffer and die. And Peter takes him aside. When he hears Jesus speaking of the coming crucifixion, Peter takes. The word takes here means that Peter is leading Jesus. Peter's like, Jesus, come over here and let me help you figure some things out. And so Peter's leading Jesus aside to correct Jesus. There's a sense of forcefulness from Peter here towards Jesus. And Peter declares that such a thing will never happen. Peter seeks to separate God from suffering and death. So many churches today still seek to make that separation. But we find that so integral is the crucifixion to Jesus the Christ that when Peter attempts to separate them, when he attempts to separate Jesus from his crucifixion, he receives the strongest correction Jesus ever gave anyone. Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." No other human being has been called Satan by Jesus. And here is our representative of the church. But Peter is called Satan because Peter is attempting to do the same thing that Satan attempted to do. That is to separate Christ from the cross. Satan offered other ways to the end that he thought Jesus was seeking. He said, there's other ways you can get this without the cross. Let me separate you from your cross. And now Peter wants to separate Jesus from his cross. And Jesus tells Peter, get behind me. We can often take this as insulting, as angry, even a loss of temper. Get behind me, Satan. And we can take it as even get lost. Get out of here. Like, I don't want to hear this. But Origen rightly identifies. Jesus tells Peter, get behind me. Because as Origen says, for to be behind Jesus is a good thing. Wherefore it was said to Peter previously in Matthew 4:18-19. As Jesus walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. And he said to them, this is the same Greek that Jesus is now saying to Peter as Peter made a big mistake. Jesus said, follow behind me. Get behind me and let me lead. And I will make you fishers of men. You become fishers of men when you're behind me. The same Greek word is here. Jesus is not attacking Peter. Jesus is therapeutically healing Peter's relationship with him. He's telling Peter where to be in place with Jesus. He's calling Peter back to the right place to be. Peter has, from a good place, positioned himself as the one in front. Peter has a good, he means well. He doesn't want Jesus to go through this. And he positions himself as the one in front. He says, Jesus, let me lead you away from the others and take you aside, and let me lead you. But Jesus turned to Peter, and Jesus responded to Peter, but really the entire church for which Peter is our representative. Ultimately, what Jesus says is, when you attempt to take the lead and be out in front of me, you make yourself adverse to my plans. The name Satan also means adversary. He's saying to be out in front, to attempt to lead God down any path that is not a co-suffering path, that is not centered on the cross, is to set yourself counter to me. And Jesus continues, to separate God from the cross, to have a God who does not suffer, is to have a mind set on human things. But we want a God who doesn't co-suffer, because if we're meant to become like God, we would want to become like a God who doesn't suffer. But Jesus says that he can't be separated from his cross. Matthew 16:24. Jesus told his disciples, if any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Not only can Jesus not be separated from his cross, but Jesus says, as I am defined, and as my cross is the center of my definition, so those who follow behind me will be defined by their cross. The church wants to say that Jesus was defined by suffering so that we don't have to be. But that's not what we read from Jesus here. Jesus says, I must go to the cross, and now you get behind me and follow and do as I did, which is to get on the cross. And we press on through the early church. And the early church rejoiced in their suffering. Because to suffer is to know then that we're in the proper place behind Jesus. If Jesus says to follow me is to follow me into suffering, and if I'm in my suffering, I'm becoming like Jesus. We look at Matthew's word picture here. It's interesting. Peter separates himself from the disciples to take Jesus aside. So you have the disciples, you have Peter take Jesus, and Peter leads Jesus away. And so you have the disciples on one side, you have Peter on the other, and you have Jesus in the middle as Peter's pulling Jesus this way. So we have this image of Jesus between Peter and the disciples. The disciples are here, Peter's here, Jesus is here. And with Peter in the lead, he and Jesus have this engagement. And Matthew records that Jesus turns to Peter. So Jesus in the middle, disciples to Peter. He turns to Peter and he talks to Peter. And he says, get behind me. The next thing Jesus does, he speaks to his disciples. What does this mean that Jesus has just done? In order to speak to the disciples from whom Peter was leading him away, Jesus has turned to them now. He says, Peter, get behind me. You're now behind me. Listen, disciples. Jesus has placed Peter behind him. Jesus has not abandoned Peter. Jesus has situated Peter right where he needs to be. Jesus places Peter behind him, and now with Peter in the following position to his rabbi, to Jesus, Peter becomes exemplary. for what Jesus says it means to follow him. Peter's now behind Jesus, following him. And Jesus says to the disciples, here is Peter now following me. And let me tell you what that means. It means following my cruciformed path. Cruciformed means shaped by the cross. And he says, when you follow in my cruciformed path, you will take upon yourself your cross. Very often, we take picking up our cross as denying ourselves. We make it about us. But that misses the greater point of the cross. Why did Jesus give himself up? Why are we to die to ourselves? It's for the love of neighbor. Picking up my cross is not merely to live an ascetic life of denying myself. Look at how holy I am because I don't do these things. To pick up my cross is not to deny myself. To pick up my cross is actually distinct and secondary to denying myself. As we read this here, I deny myself before I pick up my cross because the cross is not related to me. To pick up my cross is to pick up the needs of my neighbor. To pick up my cross is to therefore pick up the cross of others. The cross of others becomes my cross. And my cross is the one that others pick up. So that all who follow Jesus, they're picking up each other's crosses. And in doing so, we come to realize that we're all actually on the same cross. And it's also the cross upon which Jesus ascended. It's a communal cross of need. I deny myself, and what's left? Others, and the needs of others. Verse 25 is interesting because it makes these two contrasting statements. And I consider that if it is about life and death, it would make more sense for it to read a different way. As we read verse 25, I'll go back previous slide here. As we read verse 25, it says, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Well, if it's about life and death, it would make sense to me that it would read something like this: for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life will save it. But that's not how it reads. Rather, we have an interesting, it's a wordplay here. In the beginning of two statements, we consider life is saved or lost. But in the second half, life is lost or found. In the second half, the parable might come to mind in Luke of a lady who loses a coin. In losing the coin, she loses her perception of the coin. The coin hasn't stopped existing. The coin hasn't vanished or died. The coin hasn't even lost its worth. In fact, she's searching high and low for the lost coin, specifically because it still has worth. Simply because it's lost doesn't mean there's no more worth. A lost coin is still a good coin. It's just not useful until you can reunite with it. What's Jesus saying in these contrasting statements here? We can take the first part of the statement where we're looking at picking up our cross, which is a communal cross. And the first part of the statement looks at two options that we can make in life. The first part of the statement, or the first statement, it'd be life that is saved from the communal cross. Jesus says you can seek to save your life. You can save yourself from the communal cross, and so this would be seen as an act of selfishness and solely living for my own interest. living as a pure individual. He says, so you can save yourself as an individual from the communal cross. Or you can lose your life. You can lose yourself into the communal cross. I can join myself to my neighbors so that there's no longer just an individual me. Upon the communal cross, I meld with others into a singular humanity of agape love. And I then seek communal success of meeting needs. Jesus says that if I choose the first one, a choice of selfish isolation from the needs of others, I will find one day that I have lost sight of the genuine me. I'll no longer be in possession of it. It will be lost somewhere. Doesn't mean the genuine me has ceased to exist. Doesn't mean that it's not still valuable. But I've lost it to where the genuine me is of no use anymore until I can find it. So he says, if you take the first option, you will lose yourself. On the other hand, Jesus says that if I will place myself upon the great cross of humanity, if I will lose myself into the cross and allow myself to merge into a singular humanity, it is then that upon losing myself into that I'll actually find myself. What ends up lost on the other path becomes fully found on the second path. The cruciformed path leads us to find life. When we feel like, if I give up my life and then if I invest in everyone else, what about my life? And Jesus says, that's when you really find it. Verse 26 then continues, and it's interesting as well. It says, for what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? Multiple ancient works, they show that the Greek words that we translate here as gain and forfeit. Throughout numerous Greek works, these words were commonly contrasted with each other. The contrast was between securing a better position or suffering damage to one's position. And Jesus is saying, what good is it if you're improving your position in the world at the injury of your soul? You're getting better here and you're getting worse over here. Jesus' words here carry this to the extreme end. If one could win completely at life on earth, if one could secure for themselves everything that is to be found in the physical world, Jesus says, what good is it then if the entire world would have cost you your entire soul? Now, we know that no human can gain the entire world. So this means that there's no soul that's truly completely forfeit. But Jesus carries it to its extreme end. By contrasting the Greek words, it means that basically in the process of trying to gain any part of the world, you will find that you are damaging or giving up a bit of your soul. And if you could conquer the entire world and possess all the money and possess everything, Jesus says it would have then cost you your entire soul. But just because no human could truly gain the entire world, it doesn't stop them from trying. And they give up bits of their soul in the process. Even churches give up bits of their souls as they seek to at least gain a whole world of souls. If not, gain the entire world. Churches have abused, covered up, and even killed to seek just a bit of the whole world that they want to possess. The church is not exempt from this rule, and the church must ask, At what price to the church's soul are we seeking to gain the world?